Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant. Today I'm going to be covering this book, The Ghost King. It's book 3 in the Transitions trilogy of the Dritz Do'Urden series. This is an interesting one, and there's a lot going on in it. This is a trilogy set immediately after the Hunter's Blade trilogy, and this book follows the Pirate King, which was kind of a transitional event in Forgotten Realms history, but in a weird way. This is a 2010 copyright book, cover art by Todd Lockwood, who also did that art right there. There's, first mass market paperback printing, July 2010. So, what this book does and what this trilogy does is going to be discussed in this video. The trilogy covers events from effectively stuff that happened after the Time of Troubles, which separates a couple editions in D&D. In Neverwinter Nights, Obold had already conquered parts of the north, and so the Orc King is catching up to published books already. Published setting books for the game Dungeons & Dragons. The Pirate King is set during 3rd edition lore, where the city of Luskan falls and some drow mercenaries effectively become the puppet masters to the fall of Luskan and then its events moving forward. The Ghost King takes place during the event that separated 4th edition from 3rd edition. It's well known on the internet, within certain circles at least, that this event was not planned by Ed Greenwood, but was instead forced upon the setting, and the two main authors, Ed Greenwood and R.A. Salvatore, immediately put together a plan on how to steer events of their setting back towards a post-Spellplague event. Because in their mindset, this was a terrible decision for the setting, and so it was going to eventually fail, and they were eventually going to need to reset the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. And the event I'm talking about is the Spellplague. And this is a big event where one of the gods, and again, this is the Time of Troubles was forced upon Ed Greenwood as well. On Twitter, he has said that if he could, any of those major setting screwing events, those would have been non-existent if he maintained control of the setting as much as he'd like. And in the Time of Troubles, Kelimvor took over as the god of dead, Midnight took over as the goddess of magic, and Cyric took over as the god of insanity and of assassination. And the way they justify the Spellplague happening is that Cyric, who was jealous of the relationship between Kelimvor and Midnight as mortals, and that continued relationship as immortals, as deities, Cyric murders Midnight. And this causes the collapse of the Weave, because Midnight's job isn't to govern magic so much as it is to maintain the Weave, which is the manner by which magic users access their spells in the Forgotten Realms. The collapse of the Weave causes a lot of shenanigans to happen, including kind of a shadow weave. So the main goddess of the plane of shadow kind of tries to take over and supplant the weave with the Shadow Realms weave. There's a lot of gods that fall as a result of one of the gods falling, Asmodeus, the archdevil, ends up ascending to full godhood. And one of his first acts is to make it so that all tieflings are of his blood. Tieflings were already devil descended, but they could be descendants of Dispater, one of his archdukes, or another of his archdukes, or just any of the devils in general. But one of his first godly acts is to make them all his, rather than any other devils. Now, that doesn't happen in this book, but that is kind of what's going on with the Spellplague. Arcane magic fails, some gods fall, some gods disappear, some entities become gods. And how that affects this is that Cadderly, the lover of Dritz Do'Urden, had been learning how to become a wizard in between the events of the Hunter's Blade trilogy and this book, The Ghost King. And when the Spellplague collapses, it rebounds on many casters. Some of them, their spells rebound on them, some of them they go insane. In this case, Cadderly becomes comatose, locked in time. Literally, her arms cannot move, her body is stuck in the exact position it was when the Spellplague struck her. And Dritz Do'Urden goes to seek help from whoever he can. And what they find out is that a lot of magic items remain functioning, but any new magic items don't. So anything that has a permanent effect, like the hammer forged by Brainor Battlehammer, that one has a permanent effect. It's always going to keep that effect. But charge-based magic items don't necessarily work. Things like wands sometimes go awry. But what they do is they equip a team of horses with horseshoes of speed, and then cross thousands of miles over several weeks, I think maybe a month, to get to the chosen of a god that they've worked with before. And funnily enough, the chosen of Denir, the god that the chosen that they're going to request help from, is another of R.A. Salvatore's characters. And this book deals heavily with R.A. Salvatore's characters all being in one place at one time while dealing with an apocalyptic threat. Cadderly ends up comatose. The god Denir basically infuses his magic into the weave to try to stabilize it, which means that Cadderly, that priest of Denir, ends up losing his power, but is granted power in what he believes is a final act of his deity, enough to protect his people, the priests that were at that monastery with him. So his wife, their kids, and then a couple other characters, including that the two dwarves, the one fighter and the one-armed druid that interacted with Dritz Do'Urden in the Hunter's Blade trilogy, return, and they, like I said, those two dwarves, Danica Cadderly's wife, their kids, and Brainor Battlehammer, Dritz Do'Urden, are able to escape an apocalyptic event of just hordes of undead swarming this monastery because it's a beacon of light. And it's fascinating, and I think really what it does is it resurrects the Crystal Shard, which is the name of the first Dritz Do'Urden book ever printed. The Crystal Shard is this magic artifact that is very powerful. They had previously gotten rid of it by doing something with a dragon. This was in an offshoot series, one dealing with the mercenary Jarlaxle, the one who is now involved with Luskan. And the dragon that they had dealt with died, and the Crystal Shard was gone as well. But in this book, that dragon comes back as a dracolich, and it's basically infused with undeath because of the crystal shard. And its enemies are all gathered in one spot. So not only are the undead swarming because that beacon of light, the undead are swarming because they are being controlled by this dracolich, and this dracolich wants to eliminate its enemies all at once. And the enemies, those enemies barely survive. They're the main cast and crew, R.A. Salvatore's characters. Dritz Do'Urden almost can't die. He's one of those flagship characters for the campaign setting that he's like one of those named ones, how like Mordenkainen is one of those named wizards who has named spells. Dritz Do'Urden is never going to really be killed off for the same reason that those wizards will never be irrelevant to the game of Dungeons and Dragons. They are kind of baked into the core of it. That's one of the core properties purchased by Wizards of the Coast when they bought TSR. Dritz Do'Urden survives, and they have a ceremony for the death of Cadderly at the end, and it sets up the following trilogy, which takes place about 100 years later, and basically deals with Dritz Do'Urden's adventures during 4th edition, leading into the Sundering event of the transition between 4th and 5th edition. And the Sundering event is that event that Ed Greenwood and R.A. Salvatore planned to reset the Forgotten Realms back into their control, something that they prefer. So it's a really interesting book, and it's full of the same hack and slash adventures that are in all Dritz Do'Urden books. I kind of don't like it because I actually enjoyed the Spellplague, and I actively used it in the 4th edition game that I ran for a year and a half, where it was kind of continuing, still kind of active in an area because the borders between the Feywild, the Feyworld, and the prime material plane caused a very fraying effect on the weave. And so I like that idea that the Spellplague can still be active, and that it's basically fields of wild magic, that raw magic is affecting the world in really bizarre and unpredictable ways. And I really liked 4th edition and the ways that Forgotten Realms were changed by it. So I kind of don't like the dismissive way in which Wizards of the Coast said, Ed Greenwood, the setting that is yours that predates Dungeons and Dragons, we're changing it. I don't like that at all. But I also don't like the way that the Spellplague was dismissed overall by basically the entire D&D community, by everything else. When people edition war about 4th edition, the Spellplague comes up often enough, and I just don't like that. I had some amazing times with the Spellplague, and I think it's a really interesting device that can be used in D&D. It brings unpredictability to a rather stable campaign setting. So, the Ghost King touches on the Spellplague, the start of 4th edition, the changes of magic within that edition. It deals with the breakup of the group in the Dritz Do'Urden series. Now the only two that remain are Broinor Battlehammer and Dritz Do'Urden. Regis the Halfling is gone. Cadderly is gone. Wolfgar is gone. And now it's just those two and Dritz Do'Urden's item familiar, effectively, Gwenhwyvar. That's mostly my thoughts about the Ghost King and its place within the Forgotten Realms. It's an okay Dritz Do'Urden book. I preferred the books that followed. I preferred the Hunter's Blade trilogy to this trilogy. But it's okay, and that's honestly all that needs to be said about it. Now, The cover price on this is $7.99, and I'm fairly certain I bought it from Borders for about $10. I've read it several times since then. I think I've got my money's worth out of it, but it's one of those books I keep because I have as much of that series as I've purchased in my library rather than because I really, really enjoy it. So I got my money's worth out of it. I'm not sure other readers would get their money's worth out of it. I see it a lot at used bookstores, so if you see it at a used bookstore, it's usually half off or pretty cheap. I'd recommend buying it that way. You're going to be getting it cheaper and you won't be as disappointed for the amount of money you spend on it if you don't have a good experience with this book. But overall, that's The Ghost King and my thoughts on it. Yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another book rant.